The howling wind carried ice crystals that cut like tiny knives as they whipped around the abandoned parking lot. Beneath a snow-crusted sedan, Shadow's once powerful body lay motionless, save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. 3 days. 3 days since the German shepherd had crawled under this metal shelter, wounded and terrified as the blizzard raged. His consciousness flickered like a dying flame. Fragments of memory, screaming, heat, a little girl's arms, blended with the numbing cold of his present reality. The infection in his leg had spread, turning pain into a distant, dull throb. "Stay strong, boy." The woman's voice from his past echoed as darkness closed in. The crunch of approaching footsteps barely registered until a man's shocked gasp cut through the storm. "Oh my God," Ethan Miller whispered, dropping to his knees in the snow. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Lakeside, Minnesota was the kind of small town where everyone knew your business but minded their own when it mattered. This January had brought the harshest winter in decades, with temperatures plummeting to -15 degrees and snowdrifts taller than most children. The main street's quaint storefronts stood half buried in white, their Christmas decorations now looking forlorn in the relentless winter. Ethan Miller's modest 2-story home sat on Maple Lane, its blue paint peeling slightly at the corners. Inside, empty spaces marked where photographs once hung, all packed away after Rachel's death 2 years ago. At 35, Ethan was the town's youngest veterinarian, respected for his skill, but pitied for his solitude. The accident had hollowed him out, leaving behind a man who functioned rather than lived, who worked 14-hour days at the Lakeside Veterinary Clinic because going home meant facing emptiness. 3 doors down lived Dorothy Harris, 78 years young, as she liked to say, in a cottage adorned with wind chimes and bird feeders. The widow of a Korean War veteran, Dorothy had served as a military nurse herself, her hands still steady despite arthritis that painted her knuckles red on cold mornings. She watched over Ethan like the son she never had, leaving casseroles on his porch that sometimes went uneaten. At the clinic worked Dr. Sarah Cooper, whose auburn hair and gentle hands had a calming effect on the most distressed animals. At 33, she carried a quiet strength and an unspoken love for Ethan that predated his marriage to Rachel. She kept her feelings locked away, channeling her compassion into her surgical work instead. Across town stood the charred skeleton of the Wilson property, abandoned after last spring's fire. Frank Wilson, once the town's most successful contractor, now drank his days away in a rented room above the hardware store. The man's broad shoulders now perpetually slumped under the weight of blame, his once friendly face hardened into permanent lines of grief. And then there was Shadow, a German shepherd whose powerful body now lay broken under Ethan's car. No one yet knew his story, how he had once proudly worn a military training vest, how he had tried to save a little girl from flames, or how the man who should have loved him had instead made him a scapegoat for unimaginable loss. The dog's sad brown eyes held secrets that would soon change everything for the people of Lakeside. Ethan Miller had spent 36 hours stranded at the clinic, sleeping on the break room couch, while tending to a pregnant collie caught in the sudden blizzard. The snow had finally relented enough for him to attempt the drive home, his old Subaru crawling through unplowed streets. He pulled into his usual spot in the apartment complex lot, exhaustion weighing on him like a physical presence. That's when he saw it, a dark shape beneath the sedan parked next to his space. At first, he thought it was debris blown by the storm, until a faint cloud of vapor, breath, rose from beneath the vehicle. "Hello?" Ethan called, dropping to his knees in the snow. The answering whimper was barely audible. Peering under the car, Ethan's medical instincts immediately kicked in. A large dog lay curled in an awkward position, one leg clearly injured, its body trembling violently. The animal's eyes, though open, seemed unfocused. A bad sign. "Hey, buddy," Ethan whispered, careful to keep his voice gentle. "I'm going to help you, okay?" The dog made no response, not even a growl. Hypothermia, Ethan realized. Advanced stage. "Need some help there?" called a male voice. Bill Foster from the second floor was trudging through the snow toward him, followed by his teenage son. "Dog trapped under here," Ethan explained quickly. "Looks bad. We need to get him out carefully." Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Jenkins from the first floor brought blankets. Someone else arrived with a snow shovel to clear a path. Bill and his son helped Ethan position themselves around the vehicle. "On 3, Ethan instructed. 1, 2. The dog was heavier than expected, his wet fur matted with ice and something darker. Blood. As they slid him out, Ethan's clinical eye catalogued the injuries. Severe inflammation in the right hind leg, suspicious swelling in the abdomen, and numerous older scars beneath the dirty coat. This wasn't just an injured stray. This dog had suffered for a long time. As Ethan wrapped the shivering animal in blankets, a flash of memory hit him. The dog's eyes rolling back, revealing a sliver of white, and suddenly he was back in the emergency room, watching the doctors work on Rachel, her eyes doing the same as she slipped away from him. He shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. "Ethan, is that a dog?" The voice belonged to Dorothy Harris, who had apparently ventured out despite the treacherous conditions. She stood bundled in an ancient parka, her silver hair peeking out from beneath a hand-knitted cap. "Dorothy, you shouldn't be out in this," Ethan scolded gently, even as she approached with surprising speed. "Nonsense. I was a nurse in Korea. This little snow is nothing." She knelt with difficulty beside the bundle. "Oh, my," she whispered, looking into the dog's face. "Those are old soul eyes, Ethan. This one has seen things." Something in her tone gave Ethan pause. Dorothy had always had an uncanny intuition about people and, apparently, animals. "He needs a clinic," Ethan said, already mentally calculating the fastest route given the snow-blocked roads. "You're taking him in?" Bill asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Figured you'd call animal control." Ethan didn't respond. Something about the dog's quiet suffering resonated with him. "Can you help me get him to my car?" The trip to the Lakeside Veterinary Clinic took 3 times longer than usual. Twice, Ethan had to stop to clear snow from his windshield, glancing anxiously at the bundle of blankets on his passenger seat. The dog hadn't moved since they'd placed him in the car, but Ethan could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The clinic lights were still on. Dr. Peterson must have stayed after Ethan left. As he parked in the staff section, Ethan silently thanked whatever stroke of luck had left the older veterinarian working late. "Back so soon?" Dr. Peterson's surprise turned to concern when he saw Ethan's burden. "What have we here?" "Found him under a car. Been there at least 3 days, judging by the snow pattern and his condition," Ethan explained, carrying the dog to the examination room. "Severe hypothermia, injured leg, possible internal injuries." Dr. Peterson's experienced hands moved over the dog's body as Ethan started emergency warming protocols. "This is bad, Ethan. Very bad. That leg, the infection's aggressive. And look at these old wounds." The examination revealed worse news than Ethan had feared. X-rays would be needed, blood work, extensive antibiotics. The leg might need amputation. The costs would be enormous. "You know the protocol for strays," Dr. Peterson said quietly. "We can give basic care, but extensive treatment." He let the sentence hang unfinished. Ethan knew. The clinic was struggling financially as it was. Dr. Peterson had mentioned potential staff cuts just last week. But looking at the dog's face, something twisted in Ethan's chest. "I'll cover it," he heard himself say. "Personal responsibility." Dr. Peterson's eyebrows rose. "Ethan, we're talking thousands potentially. With your mortgage—" The clinic door chimed, cutting off his objection. Sarah Cooper stood in the doorway, snow melting on her auburn hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Got your text," she said breathlessly to Dr. Peterson. "Came as fast as I could." Her eyes widened when she saw the dog. What happened? While Ethan repeated his story, Sarah's surgical expertise kicked in. Her hands moved efficiently, checking pupils, gums, setting up an IV line for fluids and antibiotics. "His body temperature is dangerously low," she murmured. "But he's fighting. Look at these muscles. This was a working dog once, probably military or police trained, judging by these old scars." The phrase "working dog" triggered something in Ethan's memory. Rachel had worked with military dogs before they met. She would have known what to do, how to help this particular animal. The thought came with the familiar ache of her absence. "I've got heated blankets in my car," came Dorothy's voice from the doorway. No one had noticed her follow them to the clinic. "Military medical surplus. Best quality. I'll fetch them." Before anyone could object to the elderly woman going back out into the cold, she had disappeared, returning minutes later with thermal blankets that indeed looked military grade. "Dorothy," Sarah asked gently, "how did you get here? The roads are terrible. Earl from next door. His truck can get through anything." She settled into a chair with a stubbornness that suggested she wouldn't be leaving any time soon. "Now, what's this about costs being a problem?" Dr. Peterson sighed. "This dog needs extensive care. The clinic can't absorb—" "Then we won't ask the clinic to," Dorothy interrupted firmly. "Between Ethan, myself, and I'm sure others, once they hear, we'll manage." Outside, the snow began falling again, thick flakes illuminated by the clinic's exterior lights. Inside, 4 people worked to save a dog none of them knew, for reasons none could fully articulate. As Sarah gently cleaned the matted fur, she uncovered a patch of darker hair on the dog's back, a pattern that looked almost like a shadow. "Shadow," Ethan said suddenly. "That's what we'll call him." The dog's ear twitched slightly at the sound, the first voluntary movement they'd seen. "I think he likes it," Dorothy whispered. "Every soul needs a name." The X-ray machine hummed softly as Sarah positioned the plates beneath Shadow's sedated form. They had managed to stabilize his temperature, but the infection in his leg remained their primary concern. Ethan stood by the monitor, his exhausted eyes fixed on the screen as images slowly materialized. "There," Sarah pointed to a bright white spot on the femur. "That's not good. The infection's reached the bone." But Ethan was staring at something else, a small rectangular shape embedded in the tissue between Shadow's shoulders. "Is that a microchip?" Sarah leaned closer. "It is. And look, there are metal fragments scattered through his hindquarters. Old shrapnel, maybe?" Her finger traced several tiny bright spots. "This dog has history, Ethan." As Sarah prepared to scan the microchip, Ethan gently examined Shadow's coat, more thoroughly. Now cleaned of snow and dirt, the German shepherd's fur revealed a patchwork of old scars, some surgical, others jagged and haphazard. One particularly prominent scar ran across his right flank, puckered and poorly healed. "Someone did this deliberately," Ethan muttered, rage building in his chest. "This wasn't an accident." The microchip scanner beeped, displaying a registration number. Sarah immediately entered it into the national database. The silence stretched as they waited, broken only by Shadow's labored breathing and the gentle snoring of Dorothy, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion in the waiting room chair. "Got it," Sarah said finally. "Registered to a Wilson family in—" "Ethan, this is right here in Lakeside, 42 Oak Ridge Drive." Ethan frowned. "The house that burned down last spring? That Wilson family?" "Registration date is 14 months ago. And there's a note," Sarah's voice faltered. "Shadow was reported deceased in a house fire 8 months ago. Frank Wilson was the registered owner." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Everyone in Lakeside knew the story. Frank Wilson, who lost his wife and daughter in a house fire while he was allegedly out drinking. The tragedy had transformed a once respected community member into a shell of a man, drowning in alcohol and guilt. That can't be right. Ethan shook his head. If Shadow supposedly died in that fire, how did he end up under a car during this blizzard, 8 months later? Before Sarah could respond, the monitor tracking Shadow's vitals beeped urgently. His temperature was spiking, pulse racing. The infection was accelerating despite the antibiotics. For the next 2 hours, they worked frantically to stabilize him, postponing the mystery of his origins in favor of keeping him alive. By dawn, Shadow had been moved to intensive care, a cocktail of powerful antibiotics flowing into his veins. The immediate crisis had passed, but Dr. Peterson's morning assessment was blunt. The infection has colonized too much tissue. Standard protocol would be amputation. Ethan stood by Shadow's kennel, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Despite everything they'd done, the dog's damaged leg was swollen to twice its normal size, an angry red line tracking up toward his abdomen. "We could try an experimental antibiotic regimen," Sarah suggested quietly. "I read about it in last month's veterinary journal. It's aggressive but has shown promise in severe cases like this." Dr. Peterson shook his head. "The cost would be prohibitive, and the success rate is what, 40%? For a stray?" "He's not just a stray," Ethan said, surprising himself with the fierceness in his voice. "He's someone's lost dog. And those metal fragments, the surgical scars. He might have been a service animal." "Military." Dorothy's voice came from the doorway, where she stood with a thermos of coffee and a determined expression. She'd gone home to change, but had returned with breakfast for everyone. "Those are the marks of a military working dog. My husband trained them after Korea." Ethan looked at her with surprise. In 2 years of living near Dorothy, he'd never heard this detail about her late husband. She had a way of revealing information in perfectly timed doses. "How can you tell?" Sarah asked. "The pattern of the surgical scars, very specific. Military Medical Corps has protocols for field surgeries on canine units." Dorothy approached Shadow's kennel without hesitation, her age-spotted hand reaching through the bars to gently stroke his head. To everyone's surprise, the sedated dog leaned slightly into her touch. "This boy served his country. I'd bet my pension on it." Something shifted in Dr. Peterson's expression. Like many in their generation, military service commanded his deepest respect. "I'll make some calls about that experimental treatment," he said, leaving the room with new purpose. Left alone with Sarah and Dorothy, Ethan finally allowed his professional facade to crack. He sank into a chair, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I keep seeing Rachel," he admitted quietly. "When we first found him, when his eyes rolled back, it was like the hospital all over again." Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her touch lingering just a moment too long. "The anniversary is coming up, isn't it? Next week, 2 years. Ethan swallowed hard. She would have known exactly what to do for him. Military dogs were her specialty before we met. Dorothy's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly alert. "Your Rachel worked with military dogs? Where was she stationed?" "Fort Benning, initially. Then deployment rotations." Ethan was surprised by Dorothy's intensity. "Why?" Before she could answer, a nurse appeared with printed results from Shadow's blood work. Sarah reviewed them with a deepening frown. "His white count is through the roof. And these liver values—" She looked up, her expression grave. "The infection is spreading despite everything we're doing." As if sensing their discussion, Shadow stirred in his kennel, his eyes opening to reveal dilated pupils. For the first time since his rescue, he seemed truly aware of his surroundings. His gaze moved slowly from Dorothy to Sarah, finally settling on Ethan with an intensity that sent a chill down the veterinarian's spine. "He recognizes you," Dorothy whispered. Shadow's tail, motionless until now, thumped once against the kennel floor. Then again, it was weak, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. "That's impossible," Sarah said softly. "He's been unconscious since we found him." How would he recognize Ethan? But Ethan was already on his knees beside the kennel, an inexplicable knot forming in his throat as Shadow struggled to maintain eye contact. When Ethan cautiously extended his hand through the bars, Shadow did something that left all 3 humans in shocked silence. He stretched his neck forward, ignoring what must have been considerable pain, and gently licked Ethan's fingers. The simple gesture of trust broke something loose in Ethan's chest, something that had been frozen solid for 2 years. Without warning, tears spilled down his cheeks, surprising him as much as his companions. "I'll save you," he promised Shadow hoarsely. "Whatever it takes." The police report on the Wilson fire arrived that afternoon, delivered by Officer Mike Thompson as a personal favor. The official cause had been listed as electrical fault, but Mike's notes told a different story. "Between us," he confided to Ethan outside the clinic, "Frank was drunk that night. Neighbors reported an argument, him storming out. By the time the fire was reported, it was too late for his wife and daughter." He hesitated. "There was mention of a dog in the initial statements, but no remains were found. We assumed it ran off or was already gone." Meanwhile, Dorothy had been making calls of her own. She returned to the clinic with a determined set to her jaw. "The treatment Sarah mentioned. I've found a way to get it. My late husband's VA benefits include a stipend for service animal care. It's a stretch. But if Shadow was indeed military—" "Dorothy, no," Ethan protested. "That's your money." "It's been sitting in an account gathering dust," she countered. "Gerald would have wanted this. Trust an old woman to know where her husband's heart would be." As they debated, the clinic door swung open with a blast of cold air. A man stood silhouetted against the snowy backdrop, unshaven, hollow-eyed, smelling of whiskey and desperation. "I heard you found my dog," Frank Wilson said, his voice rough as gravel. "I've come to take him home." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah instinctively moved between Frank and the door to the kennel area. Ethan straightened to his full height, suddenly very aware of his responsibility to the wounded animal in their care. "Mr. Wilson," he said carefully, "I'm not sure you understand the situation. The dog we found, Shadow, is severely injured. He needs extensive medical care." "Shadow," Frank repeated, something flickering across his haggard face. "You named him Shadow." A harsh laugh escaped him. "Fitting. He follows me everywhere. My dreams, my nightmares." His bloodshot eyes locked onto Ethan's. "You have no idea what that animal did, or didn't do." Behind them, unheard by any human in the room, Shadow's monitoring equipment began to signal distress. His heart rate escalated dramatically at the sound of Frank's voice, a physiological response that told its own story of fear and memory. The experimental treatment for Shadow began at dawn the following day. Ethan had spent the night sleeping on the floor beside the kennel, his hand occasionally reaching through the bars whenever Shadow's whimpers grew too distressed. Frank Wilson's appearance had been mercifully brief. Dr. Peterson had firmly escorted him out, citing clinic policy about intoxicated visitors and promising a discussion when Frank was sober. The unspoken question lingered in everyone's mind. What had happened between Shadow and the Wilson family? "This first round will take about 2 hours," Sarah explained as she prepared the IV infusion. "It's a targeted antibiotic cocktail with anti-inflammatory agents. The side effects can be rough: nausea, fever, potentially seizures in severe cases." Ethan nodded grimly. "I'll stay with him." "You haven't slept properly in days," Sarah protested. "Let me take the first shift." But Ethan wouldn't budge. There was something in Shadow's eyes when he looked at Ethan. Recognition, trust, perhaps even hope. Breaking that fragile connection felt impossible. The first hour passed uneventfully. Shadow dozed, his breathing labored but steady. Ethan used the time to review the medical records Sarah had compiled, studying X-rays and blood work with the focused intensity that had made him an excellent veterinarian. The metal fragments in Shadow's hindquarters weren't shrapnel, as they'd first assumed, but rather buckshot. Someone had shot him at close range. The thought ignited a slow, burning anger in Ethan's gut. The second hour brought the predicted side effects. Shadow's temperature spiked dramatically, his powerful body trembling as fever took hold. Ethan applied cooling pads, murmuring reassurances that felt inadequate against such obvious suffering. When Shadow began to retch, Ethan cleaned him with the gentle efficiency he'd once used for Rachel during her chemotherapy treatments. A memory that ambushed him, bringing unexpected tears. "You're doing great, buddy," he whispered, stroking Shadow's head as the worst of the nausea passed. "You're the strongest patient I've ever had." Whether it was Ethan's voice or simply exhaustion, Shadow eventually calmed, his eyes finding Ethan's face with that same unnerving intensity. When Ethan reached to adjust the cooling pad, Shadow did something remarkable. He shifted his massive head to rest it against Ethan's hand, a deliberate gesture of trust that left the veterinarian momentarily speechless. Sarah found them like that when she returned with fresh IV bags, Ethan sitting cross-legged on the floor, Shadow's head heavy against his palm, man and dog connected in silent understanding. "His vitals are stabilizing," she observed, checking the monitors. "That's promising." "He's fighting," Ethan replied simply. Throughout the day, a steady stream of visitors arrived at the clinic. Dorothy brought homemade chicken soup. "For you, not the dog," she instructed Ethan firmly, and stayed to knit in the corner of the treatment room, her presence somehow comforting to both patient and doctor. Dr. Peterson's wife delivered a dog bed she'd been saving for their next adoption. Even Bill and his teenage son from the apartment complex stopped by with a handmade get-well card. "Word travels fast," Sarah remarked, arranging the growing collection of small gifts and notes on the counter. "Small town," Ethan shrugged, but there was a warmth in his voice that had been absent for 2 years. By evening, Shadow was able to take small amounts of water from Ethan's hand. Each successful treatment milestone felt like a personal victory. When Shadow managed to lift his head and maintain it for several minutes, Ethan found himself grinning like a proud parent. "He's responding better than I expected," Sarah admitted during their evening assessment. "His white count is still elevated, but the spread has slowed considerably." "He's young, strong," Ethan replied. "Military trained. They don't give up easily." The mention of military training prompted Sarah to share her research findings. She'd spent her lunch break making calls to contacts at various service dog organizations. "Shadow's microchip has a military prefix code," she explained, showing Ethan her notes. "He wasn't just any service dog. He was part of an elite training program at Fort Benning for search and rescue operations." Ethan felt a jolt. Fort Benning? That's where Rachel was stationed before her last deployment. Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral at the mention of Rachel. "The timing matches up. Shadow would have been in training while she was there. Can you find out which unit handled his training? There might be records." "Already requested, but military bureaucracy moves slowly. We might hear back next week if we're lucky." They were interrupted by Dorothy's sudden, sharp intake of breath. The elderly woman had dozed off in her chair, but now sat bolt upright, pressing one hand to her chest, her face alarmingly pale. "Dorothy," Ethan was across the room in 3 strides. "Just a twinge." She tried to smile, but her breath came in shallow gasps. "Happens sometimes. Nothing to worry about." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion from Shadow's kennel drew his attention. Despite his weakened state, the German shepherd had dragged himself to his feet and was pawing frantically at the kennel door, his eyes fixed on Dorothy. The monitors showed his heart rate escalating dangerously with the effort. "Shadow, no!" Ethan rushed to calm him, fearing he'd tear out his IV line, but Shadow wouldn't settle. He whined urgently, then barked, the first vocalization they'd heard from him, a sharp, insistent sound directed at Dorothy. Sarah was already on her phone calling for an ambulance, her medical instincts recognizing what Ethan had missed in his concern for Shadow. Dorothy was displaying classic signs of a cardiac event. "How did he know?" Sarah whispered as emergency responders wheeled Dorothy out 40 minutes later, stabilized but destined for the county hospital. "He sensed it before we did." Ethan had no answer, but the incident left him shaken. Shadow had exhausted himself with the effort and now lay motionless in his kennel, the only sign of life his labored breathing. The dog had potentially risked his own recovery to alert them to Dorothy's distress, a level of awareness and selflessness that seemed almost human. That night, while Sarah took her turn watching Shadow, Ethan drove to the hospital to check on Dorothy. He found her propped up in bed, looking frailer than he'd ever seen her, but still alert. "Just a warning shot across the bow," she assured him with forced cheerfulness. "Doctor says my old ticker's still got plenty of miles left." "You should have told us you weren't feeling well." "And distract you from that poor dog? Never." She patted his hand. "Now tell me, how did you end up alone in that big house of yours? A handsome doctor like you should have a waiting list." The abrupt change of subject caught Ethan off guard. "After Rachel, it didn't seem important anymore." Dorothy's knowing gaze made him squirm. "And that pretty Dr. Cooper who looks at you like you hung the moon?" "Sarah?" Ethan blinked. "She's a colleague, a friend. I may be old, but my eyes work fine." Dorothy chuckled, then grew serious. "When Gerald died, I thought that was it for me. 37 years together, then nothing. The silence in our house was so loud I wanted to scream. Ethan waited, sensing she was building towards something. But you know what I learned? The heart doesn't have a limited capacity for love. Loving again doesn't diminish what you had before. She squeezed his hand. Rachel wouldn't want you frozen in amber, son. The drive back to the clinic gave Ethan unwelcome time to think. Dorothy's words had stirred something uncomfortable, a recognition that he'd been existing rather than living, using grief as a shield against the vulnerability of connection. Even his decision to save Shadow felt suddenly suspect. Was he trying to save the dog, or trying to succeed where he had failed with Rachel? He arrived to find Sarah dozing in a chair beside Shadow's kennel, her hand resting on the bars near his head. The scene struck him with unexpected poignancy. Sarah had always been there, steady and supportive, asking nothing in return. Had he been blind to something right in front of him? "Any change?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Sarah blinked awake, immediately checking the monitors. "His fever's down another degree. The latest blood work shows improvement in his kidney function." Ethan peered into the kennel. Shadow's eyes were open, watching him with that same unsettling intelligence. When their gazes met, the dog's tail thumped weakly against the bedding. "He was restless until I sat here," Sarah said. "It's like he knows we're trying to help him. Dorothy thinks he's special, says he has old soul eyes. She might be right." Sarah hesitated, then reached into her pocket. "I found something while you were gone. The Military Records Department returned my call." She handed him a printout, a training roster from Fort Benning dated 18 months earlier. Ethan scanned it quickly, then froze when he reached a familiar name, Rachel Miller, K-9 Training Division, Handler Certification Program. "She was his trainer," he whispered, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. "Rachel trained Shadow." "Initial trainer only," Sarah clarified gently. "He was assigned to the Wilson family about 2 months after she deployed. Part of a pilot program placing specialized rescue dogs with firefighters and emergency responders. Frank Wilson was a volunteer firefighter before his drinking got bad," Ethan remembered. "That's the connection." Shadow whined softly, as if confirming their discovery. Ethan looked at the dog with new understanding. This wasn't just any animal in need. This was a living link to Rachel, perhaps one of the last dogs she had trained before her death. The clinic door chimed, breaking the moment. Dr. Peterson entered, stomping snow from his boots. "Thought I'd check in before heading home. How's our patient?" "Improving," Sarah reported, "but we've got complications." She quickly explained about Dorothy's hospitalization and their discovery about Shadow's connection to Rachel. Dr. Peterson absorbed this with a thoughtful frown. "And our unwelcome visitor yesterday, any sign of him returning?" "Frank Wilson?" "Not yet," Ethan replied, "but legally, if he's the registered owner and can prove it. Let's cross that bridge when we come to it." Dr. Peterson checked Shadow's chart. "Financial situation still dicey. Dorothy's contribution helps, but we're looking at weeks of treatment and rehabilitation." "I'm covering it," Ethan said firmly. "Ethan, be realistic. Your salary—" "I'll figure it out." His tone left no room for argument. "This dog is not going back to Frank Wilson. Not after what he did to him." Dr. Peterson studied him for a long moment. "You don't know what happened in that house, son. Best not to jump to conclusions." But Ethan's mind was made up. Something visceral, deeper than logic, told him Shadow had suffered terrible wrongs at Frank's hands. The buckshot, the scars, the terror at Frank's voice, the evidence was written on Shadow's body and in his behavior. The following morning brought an unexpected development. Sarah arrived with coffee and a troubled expression. "Frank Wilson is in the waiting room," she announced quietly. "He's sober, clean-shaven, and asking to speak with you specifically." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. I don't think that's a good idea. He's brought documentation, ownership papers, training certificates, and She hesitated. He's different today, Ethan. Calm. He says he wants to explain what happened. Against his better judgment, Ethan agreed to 5 minutes. He found Frank seated in the waiting area, a manila folder clutched in hands that trembled slightly. The man looked haggard but clear-eyed, his disheveled appearance from the day before replaced by a desperate attempt at respectability. "Dr. Miller," Frank acknowledged, rising awkwardly. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Wilson." Ethan remained standing, maintaining distance. "I understand you have some documentation regarding Shadow?" "Yes, but first—" Frank swallowed hard. "How is he? Is he going to make it?" The genuine concern in his voice caught Ethan off guard. "His condition is stable but serious. The infection damaged his leg severely, and there were numerous other injuries. Buckshot wounds, Mr. Wilson. Someone shot him." Frank flinched. "I didn't—" He stopped, collected himself. "That wasn't me. Can I see him?" "That's not possible right now. He's in isolation during treatment." "Of course," Frank nodded jerkily. "I just thought he might remember me. From before." "He remembers you," Ethan said coldly. "His heart rate spiked dangerously when he heard your voice yesterday." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He sank back into his chair, the folders sliding from his fingers to scatter papers across the floor. As Ethan helped gather them, a photograph slipped free. A smiling, dark-haired woman with her arm around a younger, healthier-looking Frank. Between them stood a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8, her arms wrapped tightly around a younger Shadow. "My wife, Lisa. Our daughter, Emma." Frank's voice cracked. "They loved that dog. We all did." The sincerity in his grief made Ethan hesitate. This wasn't the narrative he'd constructed, the abusive owner who'd shot and abandoned his dog. There was something more complicated here, a story he hadn't yet unraveled. "What happened the night of the fire, Mr. Wilson?" Frank's eyes closed briefly, pain etching deeper lines into his face. "I've replayed it 1,000 times. If I'd been home instead of at Murphy's bar, if I'd checked the wiring like Lisa asked, if Shadow had barked sooner—" "You blame the dog?" Ethan couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "I did." Frank's honesty was brutal. "God help me, I did. He was supposed to be a rescue dog, trained to alert, to save people. But by the time the neighbors heard him barking, the fire had already—" He couldn't finish. "So, you shot him?" Ethan asked, struggling to keep his professional composure. Frank looked up sharply. "What? No. Shadow disappeared that night. I assumed he died in the fire with them. When I heard he'd been found alive." He shook his head wonderingly. It felt like a sign. A second chance. As Ethan tried to reconcile this account with Shadow's injuries, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression urgent. "Ethan, you need to come now. It's Shadow." Ethan rushed into Shadow's treatment room to find chaos. The German Shepherd was seizing violently, his powerful body arching against the restraints that prevented him from injuring himself further. Sarah was already administering an emergency anti-seizure medication while Dr. Peterson monitored vitals. "What happened?" Ethan demanded, immediately moving to assist. "Temperature spiked to 106, Sarah reported tersely. "Seizure started about 2 minutes ago." Outside, the winter storm that had briefly abated was returning with a vengeance. Wind howled against the clinic windows, and the lights flickered ominously. Frank Wilson stood helplessly in the doorway, his face ashen as he watched the dog he'd once owned fighting for his life. Should he be here? Dr. Peterson asked Ethan quietly, nodding toward Frank. Before Ethan could answer, the lights went out completely. For 3 heartbeats, they stood in perfect darkness until the emergency generator kicked in, providing dim illumination and power to critical equipment. "Generator will only last 8 hours at full capacity," Dr. Peterson warned, and the last fuel delivery was delayed because of the roads. Sarah continued working, adjusting Shadow's IV drip with practiced precision despite the reduced lighting. "The cooling blanket is offline. We need ice packs, wet towels, anything to get his temperature down." Frank stepped forward. "I can help. Just tell me what to do." The unexpectedness of his offer created a moment's hesitation, but practicality won out. Ethan directed Frank to fill bags with ice from the clinic's machine while he and Sarah worked to stabilize Shadow. The seizure had subsided, but the dog's breathing remained labored and his temperature dangerously high. "The infections reached his bloodstream," Sarah said quietly, examining new blood work results by the glow of her phone flashlight. "That's why he's crashing. We need to switch antibiotics immediately." "The specialty medications are refrigerated," Dr. Peterson reminded them. "With limited generator power, we prioritize," Ethan decided. "Shadow's medications, emergency surgical supplies, and critical monitoring equipment get primary power. Everything else can wait." The next hour passed in tense activity as they fought to save Shadow. Frank proved surprisingly helpful, following directions without question and displaying a gentleness with Shadow that contradicted Ethan's assumptions about him. When it came time to bathe Shadow with cooling cloths, Frank's touch was hesitant but tender. "I never thought I'd see him again," Frank murmured, carefully wiping Shadow's face. "After the fire, I was in a dark place. Blamed everyone. Myself, God, even Shadow. Couldn't understand why a trained rescue dog didn't save my family." Ethan remained guarded but felt his certainty wavering. "If you didn't shoot him, how do you explain the buckshot we found?" Frank's expression darkened. "After I reported him missing, I heard rumors some farmers on the outskirts of town were shooting at a stray German shepherd raiding their chicken coops. I searched for weeks, but never found him." His voice broke. "I thought he'd died alone out there. That was another weight on me." Outside, the storm intensified. Snow accumulated against the clinic doors, and the wind found every crack and crevice, sending cold drafts through the building. Dr. Peterson checked the generator anxiously, calculating remaining fuel against the storm forecast. "County emergency services are overwhelmed," he reported, returning from a call attempt. "Power's out across 3 towns. No road clearance until morning at the earliest." The clinic door burst open, admitting a blast of snow and frigid air, followed by the bundled figure of Dorothy Harris. She stomped snow from her boots, unwinding a scarf from her face to reveal determined eyes above flushed cheeks. "Dorothy!" Sarah exclaimed. "You're supposed to be in the hospital." "Checked myself out," the elderly woman announced without apology. "Heard about the power outage on my police scanner. Figured you'd need these." She patted the large canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Gerald's old field medical kit. Has everything from hand-crank chargers to surgical supplies. Military grade." Ethan moved to help her with the bag, noting with concern how she pressed a hand to her chest after the exertion. "You shouldn't have come. Your heart is just fine for what needs doing." Dorothy cut him off. Her gaze fell on Frank, and her expression cooled noticeably. "Mr. Wilson, didn't expect to see you here." Frank nodded awkwardly. "Mrs. Harris?" Dorothy's arrival seemed to shift the energy in the room. She unpacked her late husband's kit with brisk efficiency, producing battery-operated lamps that cast a warmer glow than the generator's emergency lights. From the depths of the bag came thermal blankets, chemical heat packs, and a portable medical monitor that looked military surplus, but functionally advanced. "Gerald never threw anything away," she explained, setting up the equipment. "Said you never know when disaster might strike." Shadow remained critically ill, but the immediate crisis of his seizure had passed. His breathing had stabilized, though his temperature remained elevated. Ethan found himself working alongside Frank, their shared concern for Shadow temporarily bridging the gulf of suspicion between them. "I don't understand how he ended up under your car," Frank said as they changed Shadow's cooling packs. "After all this time—" "Fate, maybe," Ethan offered, surprising himself with the suggestion. "Or something more deliberate." Frank looked at him questioningly. "Rachel, my late wife, she trained Shadow initially," Ethan explained, "before he was assigned to your family. It's too strange to be coincidence." Frank's eyes widened. "Your wife was Rachel Miller, the trainer from Fort Benning?" Ethan nodded. "She was incredible with him," Frank said softly. "Came to our house personally to help with the transition. Emma adored her." He hesitated. "I didn't realize she had passed." "I'm sorry." The genuine sympathy in Frank's voice caught Ethan off guard. Two grieving men, connected by loss and by the animal fighting for his life between them. The realization was disorienting. A sudden crash of breaking glass interrupted the moment. The clinic's back window had shattered under the weight of an ice-laden tree branch, allowing snow and freezing air to pour into the building. The temperature in the treatment room dropped precipitously. "We need to move, Shadow," Sarah decided immediately. "This room will be too cold within minutes." "My truck's outside," Frank offered. "Four-wheel drive. We could transport him to the county hospital's vet annex." "Too risky in his condition," Dr. Peterson countered, "and the roads are impassable anyway." "The break room," Ethan suggested. "It's windowless, and we can redirect generator power there." Moving Shadow proved challenging. Despite his weakened state, he was still a large dog, and any movement clearly caused him pain. They improvised a stretcher from a blanket, Frank and Ethan carefully carrying him while Sarah managed his IV lines, and Dorothy brought the essential equipment. The break room was small but defensible against the encroaching cold. They settled Shadow on the couch, transforming the space into a makeshift intensive care unit. Dorothy produced more surprises from her seemingly bottomless bag: chemical hand warmers, battery-operated space heaters, even dehydrated soup packets that could be reconstituted with hot water from the office thermos. "I've lived through blizzards before," she said matter-of-factly. "You learn to prepare." As they worked to stabilize Shadow in his new location, the dog's condition suddenly deteriorated again. His temperature spiked higher than before, and his breathing became erratic. Sarah rushed to administer emergency medications, her face tight with concern. "His system is overwhelmed," she told Ethan quietly. "The infection, the stress of moving him, it's too much." "There must be something else we can try," Ethan insisted, the professional detachment he maintained with other patients evaporating entirely. "The only guaranteed solution would be amputation," Dr. Peterson reminded him. "Remove the infected tissue completely. But in his weakened state, surgery that invasive could kill him," Ethan finished. The impossible choice loomed before him: risk a potentially fatal operation or watch Shadow succumb to infection. Frank, who had been silently observing from the corner, stepped forward. "Do whatever gives him the best chance," he said firmly. "Cost isn't an issue. I'll cover everything." The offer startled everyone. Dr. Peterson looked skeptical. "Mr. Wilson, with all due respect, veterinary intensive care costs thousands—" "I'm selling my property," Frank interrupted. "The insurance settlement from the fire." I've just been sitting on it. Can't rebuild there anyway. Too many memories." He looked at Shadow, his expression raw with emotion. This is what Lisa and Emma would want. They loved him so much. Dorothy, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, suddenly clutched at her chest, her face contorting in pain. The color drained from her complexion, and she swayed dangerously. "Dorothy!" Sarah was at her side instantly, easing her into a chair. "Is it your heart again?" The elderly woman couldn't speak, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. Even through his own distress, Ethan recognized the classic signs of a serious cardiac event. Without proper equipment or medications, Dorothy's situation could quickly become fatal. As Sarah and Dr. Peterson attended to Dorothy, Ethan noticed Shadow's behavior change. Despite his critical condition, the dog was struggling to rise, his eyes fixed intently on Dorothy. The monitors showed his heart rate escalating dangerously with the effort. "Shadow, stay down," Ethan urged, trying to restrain him gently. But the German shepherd was determined. With trembling legs, he managed to drag himself to the edge of the couch. Before anyone could stop him, he had slid to the floor and was crawling toward Dorothy, leaving a trail of disconnected monitoring wires behind him. "What is he doing?" Frank whispered, watching in astonishment. Shadow reached Dorothy's feet and, with what appeared to be his last reserves of strength, placed his head on her lap. His eyes locked with hers in silent communication. Dorothy's labored breathing eased slightly. She managed to lift one shaking hand to rest it on Shadow's head. "Good boy," she murmured. "Such a good, brave boy." The moment held a strange power that none of them could explain. Shadow's presence seemed to calm Dorothy, giving her the strength to fight through the worst of her episode. After several tense minutes, her breathing steadied, and color gradually returned to her face. "We need to get you to a hospital," Sarah insisted when Dorothy could speak again. "Not in this storm," Dorothy replied weakly. "And not while this boy needs us." Her fingers gently stroked Shadow's ear. "He came to me when I needed him most. I won't abandon him now." In the dim light of the emergency lamps, with the storm howling outside, Ethan found himself confronting truths he'd been avoiding. Shadow's determined crawl to Dorothy's side despite his own suffering. Frank's willingness to sacrifice financially for a dog he'd once blamed. Dorothy's stubborn courage in the face of her own mortality. And Sarah's quiet, unwavering presence through everything, her skilled hands saving lives while her heart remained unacknowledged. "I've been so blind," Ethan whispered, the words not intended for anyone but somehow heard by Sarah, whose eyes met his with sudden vulnerability. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, the generator lights flickered ominously, then died completely, plunging the room into darkness save for Dorothy's battery lamps. The faint beeping of Shadow's remaining monitoring equipment faded to silence. "Generators out of fuel," Dr. Peterson announced grimly. "And we've lost power to the refrigeration unit with the specialty antibiotics." In the semi-darkness, with one patient struggling for breath and another fighting a life-threatening infection, Ethan faced the reality that good intentions and medical skill might not be enough. They were isolated, resource-limited, and running out of options. "I need to tell you all something," Frank said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "About the night of the fire. What really happened. What I did." He drew a shuddering breath. "What I did to Shadow." In the dim glow of Dorothy's military lamps, Frank Wilson's face was a landscape of shadows and regret. The small group huddled closer as he began to speak, his voice barely audible above the howling storm outside. "I was drinking heavily that night," he admitted. Had been for months. Lisa and I were fighting about it constantly. That evening, she threatened to leave, take Emma with her. Frank's hands trembled as he spoke. I stormed out, went to Murphy's bar, got even more drunk. When I came home past midnight, I fell asleep on the couch with a lit cigarette. The confession hung in the air like smoke. No one spoke, allowing Frank's painful truth to unfold. Shadow woke me up barking. The kitchen was already engulfed. I ran upstairs trying to reach Lisa and Emma, but the staircase collapsed under me. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing extensive burn scars. I couldn't get to them. The neighbors pulled me out. I could still hear Shadow barking inside, trying to reach my family. Frank's composure cracked. When the firefighters finally got in, they found Emma's body near her bedroom window. Lisa was still in bed. They said the smoke probably got them before the flames. He drew a ragged breath. But Shadow wasn't there. Somehow he'd gotten out. Ethan found his voice. If he escaped, how did he end up injured? 3 days later, I found him at the edge of our property. He was whimpering, hiding under the shed. Frank's voice hardened with self-loathing. I was out of my mind with grief, still drunk most of the time. I convinced myself if he'd barked sooner, if he'd somehow gotten Lisa and Emma out instead of saving himself, they'd still be alive. Frank couldn't meet anyone's eyes now. I beat him. God help me, I beat that dog until he ran off yelping. Then I grabbed my shotgun and fired at him as he disappeared into the woods. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. I reported him missing because I was a coward. Couldn't admit what I'd done. The raw confession left the room in stunned silence. Shadow, who had remained by Dorothy's side, raised his head slightly at the sound of Frank's distress, his expression inscrutable. "Frank," Dr. Peterson said quietly, "what you did was terrible. But Shadow survived, and now you have a chance to make amends." "Do I deserve that chance?" Frank whispered. Before anyone could answer, Dorothy made a soft sound of distress. Her brief stability had been deceptive. Now her breathing grew labored again, her complexion ashen. Sarah immediately moved to check her pulse, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Her heart rhythm is irregular," she reported. "She needs emergency care we can't provide here." The situation was deteriorating on multiple fronts. Shadow's fever continued to rise despite their efforts, and without refrigerated medications, his infection would inevitably worsen. Dorothy's cardiac condition demanded immediate professional intervention, and outside, the blizzard showed no signs of relenting, turning the clinic into an island of increasingly desperate circumstances. The county emergency services said no vehicles could get through until morning. Dr. Peterson reminded them grimly. Ethan made a decision. "We'll try the landline again. If we can reach the medevac unit at Mercy Hospital, they might attempt a helicopter extraction." But the phones were down now, too, the lines presumably damaged by ice and wind. Their isolation was complete. In the face of this dire reality, Ethan found himself at Shadow's side, one hand resting on the dog's fever-hot flank, the other clutching his cell phone with its useless "no service" message. 2 years of carefully maintained emotional distance crumbled as he confronted the possibility of losing this dog who had somehow breached his defenses. "I can't lose you too," he murmured to Shadow, unaware that Sarah had approached until she laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We're not giving up," she assured him, though her medical training told her they were running out of options. Without intervention, Shadow would likely not survive the night, and Dorothy's condition was precarious at best. Frank, who had been standing silently by the window watching the snow, suddenly straightened. "There's a plow coming down the street," he announced. "And behind it, is that an ambulance?" They crowded around the window. Through the whirling snow, the yellow flashing lights of a snowplow were indeed visible, followed by the red and white emergency lights of an ambulance. "That's impossible," Dr. Peterson said. "They said no emergency vehicles until morning." Dorothy managed a weak smile from her chair. "I may have pulled a few strings before I left the hospital. My late husband's army buddy runs the county emergency management office." Hope flickered briefly, only to be extinguished when the vehicles stopped a block short of the clinic, clearly unable to navigate the final stretch of unplowed road. "They can't reach us," Sarah said, watching the distant lights. Ethan made a swift calculation. "Dorothy needs that ambulance, if we can get her to them." "I'll carry her," Frank volunteered immediately. "I know this town blindfolded. I can make it through the snow." "What about Shadow?" Sarah asked the question they were all thinking. Ethan looked at the dog who had come to mean so much to him in such a short time. Shadow's breathing was labored, his once powerful body wasted by infection and fever. Without the specialized care of a veterinary hospital, his chances were diminishing by the hour. "The ambulance might take both," Frank suggested, "Dorothy and Shadow." "Emergency services won't divert resources for an animal during a crisis," Dr. Peterson said gently. "You know that, Ethan." Shh. The impossible choice loomed before them. Focus their efforts on saving Dorothy, the most critically ill human patient, or continue fighting for Shadow against diminishing odds. In the loaded silence, Shadow somehow found the strength to lift his head. His amber eyes moved from face to face, finally settling on Ethan, with an expression of such clear understanding that everyone in the room felt it. The strange sense that this animal comprehended exactly what was at stake. With trembling legs, Shadow pushed himself to standing position. He swayed dangerously, but remained upright, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. "He's telling us something," Dorothy whispered. Before anyone could stop him, Shadow limped painfully to Dorothy's side and nudged her hand with his muzzle. Then he turned to Frank, approached him cautiously, and, in a gesture that brought tears to the man's eyes, briefly pressed his head against Frank's leg, the closest thing to forgiveness anyone had ever witnessed from an animal. Finally, Shadow returned to Ethan, collapsing at his feet as though the effort had depleted his last reserves of strength. His eyes closed, his breathing grew shallow, and the monitoring equipment still attached to him began to emit a warning tone. "He's crashing," Sarah said urgently, moving to intervene. In that moment, Ethan felt something break inside him, the protective wall he'd built around his heart since Rachel's death. The pain was excruciating, but somehow purifying, like setting a dislocated bone. He dropped to his knees beside Shadow, gathering the dog's heavy head in his lap. "Please," he whispered, not even sure who or what he was pleading with. "Please don't take him too." Frank had moved to Dorothy's side, already preparing to carry her through the storm. Dr. Peterson was collecting essential medical supplies for the journey. Sarah worked frantically over Shadow's failing body, administering emergency medications with little hope of their efficacy. And outside, unnoticed by any of them, a second set of emergency lights had appeared behind the ambulance, the distinctive red and blue pattern of a specialized veterinary emergency transport. Rachel. The name escaped Ethan's lips without conscious thought, a whispered prayer as he cradled Shadow's head. The German shepherd's eyes fluttered at the sound, his ears twitching slightly despite his near-unconscious state. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her hands stilling on the syringe of emergency medication she'd been preparing. Ethan repeated the name, louder this time. "Rachel." Shadow's response was unmistakable. a subtle shift of his head, a momentary focus in his fever-glazed eyes. Something about the name resonated with him, cutting through layers of pain and disorientation. "It's like he recognizes it," Frank said, pausing in his preparations to transport Dorothy. Ethan's mind raced, recalling what they knew about Shadow's history. Rachel trained him at Fort Benning. They must have spent significant time together. Dorothy, despite her own distress, watched the interaction with keen interest. "Military dogs are trained to respond to specific commands," she said weakly. "Gerald's unit had protocols, certain words that would trigger specific behaviors even when the dog was injured or disoriented." A reset protocol, Sarah realized. She turned to Frank. "Did Rachel ever mention special commands when she delivered Shadow to your family? Emergency recall words?" Frank frowned, searching his memory. "She left a training manual. Said to use it only if Shadow became distressed or unresponsive." His expression darkened. "After the fire, I burned most of their things in a rage. But some boxes went to my brother's place. The manual might still be there." "Your brother lives across town," Dr. Peterson pointed out. "There's no way to reach him in this storm." Frank's phone buzzed unexpectedly, a text message somehow getting through despite the spotty service. He read it with widening eyes. "It's Michael. He's with the emergency vehicles at the roadblock. Says there's a specialized animal rescue unit with them." "How's that possible?" Ethan asked, still cradling Shadow. "Dorothy's doing, I'd wager," Dr. Peterson said, glancing at the elderly woman who managed a small, mysterious smile despite her pain. "Made a few calls before leaving the hospital," she admitted. "Thought our boy here might need more help than we could provide." The immediate challenge remained getting Dorothy and Shadow to the waiting emergency vehicles through the blizzard conditions. Frank volunteered to carry Dorothy, while Ethan and Dr. Peterson would transport Shadow on a makeshift stretcher. Sarah would bring critical medical supplies and coordinate with the rescue teams. Shadow might not survive the move, Sarah warned quietly, checking his increasingly unstable vitals. "He won't survive if we stay," Ethan replied, his decision made. They bundled Dorothy in thermal blankets from her military kit. Frank lifted her with surprising gentleness, her slight frame almost childlike in his strong arms. Shadow presented a greater challenge, nearly 100 pounds of deadweight now unresponsive to stimuli, his breathing increasingly labored. "We'll need to stabilize his leg for transport," Sarah directed as they transferred him to a board that would serve as a stretcher. "And keep him as warm as possible. His body temperature is dangerously unstable." As they worked, Dorothy beckoned Ethan closer with a frail gesture. "Check his collar," she whispered. "Military working dogs often have emergency information there." Ethan gently felt around Shadow's neck, finding nothing but matted fur and old scars. Then his fingers detected an irregularity in the leather collar itself, a slight bulge in the inner lining. Working carefully, he managed to extract a small metallic object, a military dog tag, tarnished and bent, but still legible. "Shadow, MWD number 4392, Handler R. Miller, Emergency Protocol, Phoenix Rising." Ethan stared at the tag, the world narrowing to those few embossed words. Rachel's name in his hand, connected to the dog fighting for his life before him. It wasn't coincidence that Shadow had ended up beneath his car. It was something beyond rational explanation. "Phoenix Rising," he repeated, the words feeling significant on his tongue. Dr. Peterson appeared at the door, interrupting the moment. "We need to move now. There's a break in the storm, but it won't last long." They formed a solemn procession, Frank leading with Dorothy securely in his arms, followed by Ethan and Dr. Peterson carrying Shadow's stretcher, with Sarah bringing up the rear, medical bag slung across her body. The moment they stepped outside, the brutal cold assaulted them, the wind stealing breath and the snow reducing visibility to mere feet. Frank forged ahead, creating a path the others could follow. The distance to the emergency vehicles, normally a 2-minute walk, became an arduous journey through knee-deep snow and ice-slicked surfaces. Dorothy, despite her own pain, maintained a quiet dignity, her eyes frequently checking on Shadow's stretcher behind them. Halfway to their destination, disaster struck. Shadow began to convulse, his powerful body jerking against the restraints that secured him to the stretcher. The sudden movement caused Dr. Peterson to lose his footing on the ice. The stretcher tilted precariously as the older veterinarian struggled to regain his balance. "Hold him steady!" Sarah called, rushing forward to help stabilize the stretcher. Ethan fought to control the situation, but Shadow's seizure was violent, his back arching, foam appearing at his muzzle. In desperation, Ethan recalled the dog tag information. "Phoenix Rising!" he shouted above the wind. "Shadow! Phoenix Rising!" The effect was immediate and astonishing. Shadow's convulsions ceased abruptly, his body going completely still save for the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His eyes opened, clear and alert for the first time since his rescue, locking onto Ethan's face with laser-like focus. "It worked," Sarah whispered, amazement clear in her voice. "The emergency protocol actually worked." They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, Shadow now eerily calm and attentive, despite his critical condition. The distant emergency lights grew closer, resolving into an ambulance, a veterinary response unit, and several police vehicles, all idling at the point where the snowplows had been forced to stop. As they approached the roadblock, a figure detached itself from the cluster of emergency responders, a man in a sheriff's uniform who looked strikingly similar to Frank. "Michael," Frank called out, his voice breaking with relief. "We've got 2 critical patients." "Bah." The sheriff, Frank's brother, directed the emergency teams to meet them, bringing stretchers through the snow. Dorothy was quickly transferred to the care of paramedics, who immediately began assessment and treatment. A separate team from the veterinary unit took charge of Shadow, their specialized equipment and expertise a stark contrast to the makeshift care they'd been providing at the clinic. "How did you know to bring the vet unit?" Ethan asked Michael as Shadow was loaded into the specialized transport. "Got a call from a Colonel Thompson at Fort Benning," the sheriff explained. "Said it was regarding a recovered military asset of high value. Called in a favor with the State Emergency Management Office." He glanced at Dorothy, who was being settled into the ambulance. "Though I suspect that lady had something to do with it as well." As the emergency teams worked, Frank approached his brother awkwardly. "Michael, I need to ask, those boxes of our stuff you took after the fire, is Rachel Miller's training manual still there?" "It's in my cruiser," Michael replied, surprising everyone. "Brought it when I heard you were at the clinic with a German Shepherd. Figured it might be important." The training manual was water-damaged but intact, its pages filled with Rachel's neat handwriting and detailed protocols for Shadow's care and commands. Frank handed it reverently to Ethan, their fingers briefly touching in a moment of unexpected connection. "She would want you to have this," Frank said simply. As Ethan leafed through the manual, a folded piece of paper fell from between its pages, an official military letter addressed to him personally, dated just days before Rachel's fatal accident. With trembling hands, he unfolded it. "Dear Ethan," it began, "if you're reading this, something has happened to me during deployment. I wanted Shadow to come to you. You two are so much alike, stubborn and loyal to a fault. He's the best I've ever trained, and he'll take care of you like you always took care of me. All my love, Rachel." The letter blurred as tears filled Ethan's eyes. Rachel had meant to send Shadow to him all along. The dog had been her parting gift, a living legacy of her love, somehow finding his way to Ethan despite impossible odds. "Dr. Miller," called one of the veterinary technicians from the transport unit. "We're ready to move out, but Shadow seems distressed when we try to close the doors. He keeps looking for someone." Ethan approached the veterinary transport where Shadow lay connected to advanced monitoring equipment. Despite his critical condition, the German Shepherd's eyes tracked Ethan's movement, a low whine escaping him when Ethan stopped at the vehicle's edge. "He doesn't want to be separated from you," Sarah observed, standing at Ethan's shoulder. "After everything he went through to find you." The veterinary team leader approached. "There's room for one person to ride with him. Usually it would be the owner." "I am his owner," Ethan said with sudden certainty, the words feeling right in a way little had since Rachel's death. "I'm going with him." As Ethan climbed into the transport beside Shadow, he felt a hand on his arm. It was Frank, his expression solemn but resolved. "Take care of him," Frank said. "Make him part of your family like he was part of ours. It's what Lisa and Emma would want." The doors closed as the convoy prepared to depart. In the climate-controlled interior of the veterinary unit, Shadow's breathing had stabilized, though his condition remained critical. Ethan sat beside him, one hand resting gently on the dog's head. "Phoenix rising," he whispered again, watching as Shadow's eyes focused on him with that same uncanny intelligence. "We're going home, boy. We're both going home." Spring came late to Lakeside, Minnesota that year. April brought the first real thaw, melting away the record snowfall that had blanketed the town for months. On Maple Lane, the morning sun illuminated fresh green buds on trees that had stood skeletal against winter skies only weeks before. Ethan Miller stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching as Shadow carefully navigated the 3 steps down to the yard. The German Shepherd moved with deliberate precision, his right hind leg still bearing the evidence of his ordeal, a slight limp that would likely always remain. But considering how close they'd come to amputation, the minor impairment seemed miraculous. "Take it slow, buddy," Ethan called, though the encouragement was unnecessary. Shadow had proven himself remarkably adaptive during his 3-month recovery, neither pushing too hard nor giving up when rehabilitation exercises became challenging. The winter storm that had nearly claimed Shadow's life had transformed Lakeside in unexpected ways. Power had remained out for nearly a week, forcing neighbors who had barely acknowledged one another to cooperate for survival. Community bonds forged in crisis had persisted into spring, creating a closeness that hadn't existed before. Nowhere was this transformation more evident than in Ethan's own life. His house, once a shrine to absence with its empty picture hooks and closed doors, now bore evidence of active living. Shadow's bed occupied a sunny corner of the living room. Sarah's jacket hung beside Ethan's in the entryway, and photographs, including several of Rachel, had emerged from storage to reclaim their places on walls and shelves. "Morning, Doc," Dorothy Harris called, making her way down the street with her walker. At 79, she had recovered from her cardiac event with characteristic determination, though she'd grudgingly accepted the mobility aid her doctors insisted upon. "Shadow's looking strong today." "Getting stronger every day," Ethan confirmed, watching as Shadow trotted over to greet Dorothy with gentle enthusiasm. The bond between the elderly woman and the German Shepherd had deepened during their parallel recoveries, each seeming to understand the other's physical limitations and determination to overcome them. Dorothy had become a fixture in Ethan's life since the blizzard, part surrogate mother, part oracle, dropping by with casseroles and unsolicited, but usually spot-on, advice. She had also taken it upon herself to educate the neighborhood children about proper animal care, using Shadow as her teaching assistant. "Don't forget you promised to bring him by the elementary school this afternoon," Dorothy reminded him. "Mrs. Peterson's third-grade class has been counting down the days." Shadow's story had spread throughout Lakeside, transformed through retellings into something approaching legend. Children drew pictures of the heroic dog who had survived 3 days trapped beneath a car in a blizzard. The local newspaper had run a feature article. Even regional news outlets had picked up the story, focusing particularly on the discovery of Rachel's letter and Shadow's eventual reunion with his intended owner. What those stories couldn't capture was the private journey of healing that had unfolded in the months since Shadow's rescue. Ethan had spent countless nights beside the dog's hospital bed during those first critical weeks, reading aloud from Rachel's training manual, his voice seeming to reach Shadow even through heavy sedation. When Shadow was finally released to come home, they had learned to navigate their shared space and mutual grief. Two wounded souls gradually finding comfort in routine and companionship. Sarah arrived as Dorothy was leaving, her auburn hair catching the morning sunlight as she stepped from her car with a bag of groceries. The transition in their relationship from colleagues to something deeper had been gradual and cautious, respectful of both Rachel's memory and the emotional walls Ethan had maintained for so long. When Sarah had first stayed overnight 2 months ago, it had felt like the most natural progression imaginable. "I brought ingredients for tonight," she called, holding up the bag. "Dorothy mentioned Frank might stop by. I figured we should have enough for everyone." Frank Wilson's transformation had been perhaps the most profound. The man who had once fired a shotgun at Shadow in drunken grief had become a dedicated volunteer at the county animal shelter, channeling his remorse into action. Sobriety suited him. His face had lost its haggard hollowness, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone doing hard but necessary work. His relationship with Shadow remained complicated. The German Shepherd never showed fear around Frank anymore, but maintained a respectful distance, as if acknowledging their shared past without quite forgiving it. Frank seemed to understand, never pushing for affection, content to simply be in Shadow's presence when invited. The gathering planned for that evening had become a monthly tradition. Dorothy, Frank, Sarah, Dr. Peterson and his wife, sometimes Michael and his family, sharing a meal and stories around Ethan's dining table. What had begun as a support system during Shadow's recovery had evolved into something like family. "Ready for your checkup, Shadow?" Sarah asked, setting down the groceries to scratch behind the dog's ears. As both his veterinary surgeon and his owner's partner, Sarah maintained a professional interest in Shadow's continuing recovery, documenting his progress for a case study she was preparing on innovative infection treatments. Shadow's responsiveness to Sarah had been immediate and complete from the moment she joined Ethan's household. He seemed to understand intuitively that she belonged there, greeting her returns from work with the same enthusiasm he showed Ethan. In quiet moments, Ethan sometimes wondered if Rachel would have approved of this new configuration of his life. The answer always came with strange certainty. She had sent Shadow to him precisely so he wouldn't remain alone. After breakfast, Ethan took Shadow for their morning walk through Lakeside Park, a routine that had become therapeutic for both of them. Shadow's physical therapist had recommended regular, moderate exercise to strengthen his healing leg, and Ethan found the routine grounded him after years of emotional drift. They were crossing the park's central meadow when Shadow suddenly stopped, his head lifting sharply, attention focused on something in the distance. Before Ethan could question the behavior, Shadow was moving with unexpected speed, pulling the leash taut as he headed for a copse of trees near the park boundary. "Shadow, wait!" Ethan called, jogging to keep up. Shadow stopped at the base of a gnarled oak tree, looking up into its branches and emitting a sharp, insistent bark, a sound Ethan hadn't heard from him before. Following the dog's gaze, Ethan spotted it. A small gray kitten, barely visible among the new spring leaves, clearly trapped and frightened. What followed was an impromptu rescue operation, with Ethan climbing the tree while Shadow remained below, his barking stopping the moment Ethan reached for the kitten. The tiny animal was dehydrated and trembling, but otherwise unharmed, its frail body fitting easily in Ethan's palm as he descended. "How did you know?" Ethan asked Shadow, who was now sitting at attention, watching the kitten with professional interest rather than predatory focus. Shadow's only response was a single thump of his tail against the ground, but Ethan understood. The training Rachel had given him to search, to rescue, to protect remained intact despite everything he had endured. It was part of his essential nature, just as healing animals was part of Ethan's. They brought the kitten home, where Sarah immediately switched to veterinary mode, examining the tiny foundling while Shadow observed with what Ethan would have sworn was professional approval. By afternoon, the kitten was sleeping in a makeshift bed, having consumed an impressive amount of formula for something so small. "Another stray finds its way to you," Sarah commented, watching Ethan gently stroke the kitten's head with one finger. "It's becoming a pattern." Ethan smiled, glancing at Shadow, who had positioned himself as sentinel near the kitten's box. "I'm starting to think some strays know exactly where they're going." Later that day, as promised, they brought Shadow to the elementary school where Dorothy had arranged his appearance as a special guest for the third-grade class studying community helpers. Shadow carried himself with quiet dignity as children gathered around him, listening solemnly as Dorothy explained how military dogs were trained to rescue people. "This is a real hero," she told the wide-eyed children, her hand resting on Shadow's head. "He saved a little girl from a fire, survived being lost and hurt, and found his way to Dr. Miller during the worst blizzard in 50 years. Shadow accepted the gentle pats and adoring attention with stoic patience. Only Ethan noticed how the dog's eyes regularly sought him out across the classroom, checking in, making sure they remained connected, even amid the crowd of excited children. That evening, as their friends gathered around the dining table, conversation and laughter filling the once silent house, Ethan watched Shadow moving comfortably among the guests. The German shepherd paused beside Frank, allowing the man a brief moment of connection, a hand gently touching his flank, an acknowledgement of how far they had both come. Later, when the house had quieted and Sarah had fallen asleep beside him, Ethan found himself awake, listening to the soft sounds of Shadow's breathing from his bed in the corner. On impulse, Ethan slipped out from under the covers and padded across the room, kneeling beside the dog who had changed his life. Shadow's eyes opened immediately, alert even in rest. "Thank you for finding me," Ethan whispered, his hand resting on the dog's warm flank, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. Shadow's response was to shift slightly, making room on his large bed. Ethan smiled and settled beside him, the way he had during those first difficult nights home from the hospital. Together, man and dog drifted to sleep, two survivors who had found in each other exactly what they needed, not replacement for what they had lost, but something new and equally precious. Outside, spring rain began to fall softly, washing away the last traces of winter from lakeside Minnesota, where a stray dog trapped under a car had changed not just one life, but an entire community, reminding everyone who heard his story that sometimes the most broken paths lead exactly where they're meant to go. In a world that often rushes past the deeper meanings, Shadow's journey reminds us that second chances appear in the most unexpected forms. Perhaps you've walked through your own blizzards, loss, heartbreak, or simply the feeling that your most meaningful days are behind you. But what if, like Ethan, your greatest connection is still waiting to find you? The German shepherd who crawled through pain and rejection to reach the exact person who needed him teaches us that healing isn't about erasing our scars, but finding someone who understands them. Dorothy knew it when she said, "The heart doesn't have a limited capacity for love." Whether you're starting over, rebuilding, or simply wondering if you still matter in this world, remember that Shadow found his purpose not despite his brokenness, but because of the strength it created in him. What unexpected blessing has found its way to your door when you needed it most? Or perhaps more importantly, to whose life might you be the shadow, the unexpected healing they're waiting for? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes our greatest comfort comes from knowing our experiences touch others.